All right, welcome back, New York Ranger fans, as well as some Winnipeg Jets fans as well. We got a very special episode today. I'm going to be joined by Harrison from Locked On Winnipeg Jets. I'm going to be talking about what Blake Wheeler has left in the tank, what happened as far as him losing the captaincy in Winnipeg, and how he will fit in with the New York Rangers going forward. All this and much, much more on today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers.
You're Locked On the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome back, Rangers fans and Jets fans. I am joined, of course, by my good friend Harrison Lee, the host of Locked On Winnipeg Jets. Harrison's been nice enough to join us here, talk a little bit about Blake Wheeler, everything that happened with him in Winnipeg. He was obviously there for a very long time, and how he might fit in with the New York Rangers. And Harrison, I figure we might as well jump right into it. But first, we do have to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And we're, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And so, Harrison, Blake Wheeler, obviously outstanding career for the Jets. He's been there forever. Was actually there for half a season when they were still the Atlanta Thrashers. So we're going way back. And obviously, getting a little bit older, going to be 37 years old before this upcoming season. But coming off a solid season for the Jets with 55 points in 72 games. So based on, what you've seen the last handful of seasons here, does he still have something left in the tank? Can he still come in and be an effective player for the Rangers and, give them some elements of, what they've been lacking in some ways?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question with Wheeler because, like you said, he's got 55 points last season, and on paper, everything looks pretty good. You've got a guy who's a former captain, a player who in his prime was honestly one of the best wingers in the NHL. And you look at a lot of the underlying metrics, you look at the way that he played, he was a truly dynamic force, but that was like 7 years ago. The version of Wheeler that kind of exists now is a guy who I think in like a limited role, right? You put him on like your third line or something. I think he's still got something pretty good. The biggest thing that happened to him as he aged in Winnipeg was that you kind of noticed a lot of the way that he used to generate offense came off the rush. I mean, he was like a super aggressive power forward. He had this one move where he'd kind of cut in on the right flank and he'd, go around the face-off circles and then basically just bully his way to the net. He had a little bit of Kreider in him, although I think Kreider probably was maybe even more, aggressive in front of the net. But Blake, certainly didn't have any sort of problem doing that. I think the version of him now that you're going to see is a guy who still has pretty good hands. He's got good passing. He's got a decent shot, although I wouldn't really rely on it. I think the biggest thing that that you're going to see with him, though, is the lack of foot speed. That was a real problem, especially late. But I think the way to alleviate that is you just give him more rest. I don't know what role the Rangers envision for him, but if you're asking him to play like 20 minutes a night, maybe even 18, that's probably putting it up there a little bit for a guy who, like you said, is getting, almost closer to 40 than I think he'd care to admit.
Yeah, I think, to start the season, we could see him possibly on the second line with Panarin and then probably either Trocheck or Hedl, depending on who they want to center that second line. But I think a middle six role is probably what the Rangers envision for Blake Wheeler. But, Harrison, I just want to ask you, kind of from the human side of things here, Blake Wheeler, again, he's been with the Jets forever, bought out of the final year of his contract. Did you see this coming? Was the writing on the wall? Was it the right decision to make? Just kind of give us a feel for that as far as, how you and maybe even some other Jets fans felt about that decision to buy him out.
It's a tough question. I think a lot of Winnipeg fans have really turned on Wheeler over the years, in part because, there's some stuff we'll talk about later. But I think for me personally, I will always have a soft spot for him. He was one of the guys that when this franchise first relocated, he became one of our underrated stars. I remember Wheeler several years ago first became like the analytic starling, the player that people didn't really recognize. And yet you looked at the charts, you looked at some of the numbers that he was putting up, and they just leapt off the page. And he was also one of the guys that I would say was really front-facing for the Jets, a very recognizable player. When you saw Wheeler, he was just this towering dude. And so he really did cement a legacy. And I mean, you could say that he's really been like a one club kind of guy. I mean, he has been with a couple of other teams, but he didn't really stick around very long before he basically became a lifelong Jet. Unfortunately, though, over time, I think the way that he wanted to do things and the way that the team has kind of been pushing with some of the younger players and stuff, eventually ran into some issues. And at some point, there was going to be a divorce. It's a shame that I think it's happened in this way. I think he's going to have a reputation where people are always going to look at him as having been part of the problem with the locker room. And it is true. But by the same token, I think he also has a really great legacy to where, one day if they sign him again for a 1-day kind of contract, he retires a Jet. He legit deserves to have his number in the rafters. I think he's that quality of player. I think regardless of what happens at the end, I think he should always be remembered fondly, even though the legacy is a little more mixed, especially with some of the stuff that came out at the end.
Fair enough. And like you said, one thing that I want to ask you a little bit later in today's episode, we're going to talk about, him losing the captaincy and what all went on there. And of course, we don't see everything that goes on behind the scenes, but I do want to get your thoughts on that. But one other thing that I wanted to ask here, when Wheeler was bought out, obviously, Ranger fans, everybody's eyebrows kind of go up a little bit. Okay, we're kind of thin at right wing. He can help there. He can be something of a power forward. Even at his advanced age, he can help in that aspect as well. But when he was bought out, I figured he'd probably get, a contract somewhere in the area of maybe like $2.5 million or $3 million. I think maybe I kind of overestimated the market this round of free agency. But what about you? I mean, he ends up signing for just 1 year and $800K. I mean, that's barely the league minimum. It felt like just a complete steal for the Rangers. Did you think he would get more than that? Or do you think maybe at this point he's kind of cup chasing a little bit since he's getting pretty late into his career here?
So I did think it was actually going to be both. And I honestly thought the Panthers would be the team to sign him. I know that he loves Maurice and Maurice really loves him. I thought he would get maybe even closer to $4 million for like a season. I think that he still has quite a bit of value to a team. I think a lot of, other organizations are going to see that skill that he brings, but it is kind of funny because Trouba's about to be his captain after it was the other way around a few years ago. So I could see, him looking at the situations of where he could live for a season. New York is a really cool place to land, and they've got a fun team. So I guess, maybe he was willing to make concessions. He's made a lot of money over his career. So at this point, I think finding a place that gives him the best chance for a ring that he feels comfortable and settled with, that's probably what he was going for. And I think Jacob and some of the other guys that have played there, Neil, of course, has probably sold the Rangers as a really good organization to join. It might have been one of those situations where he's like, look, I don't have to get paid as much. I'm willing to take a pay cut to go for all of it.
Yeah, for sure. And it's actually funny, Harrison, because, the day of free agency, you know how it is. It's just a complete sprint. We get to noon and this guy's signing here and that guy's signing there. And if you remember, that was the day that Twitter was acting all haywire and, nobody could really figure out what was going on there. And, I'm doing the live show and I'm trying to figure this out, trying to get Twitter to work. I got the NHL Network up and I've got the live chat going and people are telling me, oh, we just signed Blake Wheeler. I'm like, oh, all right, cool. And somebody's telling me, oh, for $800K. And I'm like, get out of here. Like, you guys are messing with me. My Twitter's down. It blew my mind that the Rangers were able to get him for that little of a price. But I suppose, again, what we've both said here, he's made his money. And at a certain point, man, you just want to chase that Stanley Cup. I figure, I do want to get into the stuff about the captaincy and I guess some of the, for lack of a better term, the drama that occurred with, not just Blake Wheeler, but in the Jets in general over the last couple of seasons. And we'll get to that in just a second. But first, we do have to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Birddogs. Birddogs make you look good. Birddogs stretch khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, giving you a truly sculpted look. Birddog shorts do the exact same thing as Lululemon, but they fit way better. They fit way better than regular shorts that are made of a stiff, restricting cotton. Birddogs fixed this issue by inventing cloud knit fabric that looks just like khaki, but stretches so you get a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. Birddogs also uses anti-stink sweat wicking fabric that keeps you cool and dry all day long. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL or enter promo code LockedOnNHL for a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. That is birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL or promo code LockedOnNHL for a free Yeti-style tumbler. You won't want to take off your Birddogs. We promise you. And so, yeah, Harrison, I figure we keep everything just kind of rolling here and get into, I guess, some of the more drama-laden aspects of the last few days or the last couple seasons of Blake Wheeler's run with the Winnipeg Jets. Obviously, coming into this most recent season, Blake Wheeler, seemingly to the surprise of him, and I'm sure, other people, Jets fans, maybe even yourself, Harrison, loses the captaincy. The Jets go without a captain for this past season. What was the reaction from you to that when that happened? What did the fan base think about it? I read some old articles with Wheeler where he seemed to handle it okay, about as well as you could when you're kind of surprised by this news. But the floor is yours. What all went into that? And was it a good decision? And just the whole 9 yards here.
Yeah, I think for some context, I think a lot of people have probably heard that Winnipeg's locker room has been described by guys like, was it Cody Eakin, I think, and a few other players. They've said it was one of the most toxic locker rooms they've ever been involved in, which might be a little bit much, going a little bit far, but also I think there were some real generational divides in that room. Wheeler kind of represented the old guard, Bufflin, Wheeler. At one point, I think Ladd may have been part of that. I don't know if it was really that much of that era of the Jets room, but then you've got, the young upstart Scheifele, Ehlers, Kyle Connor, Hellebuck, a lot of these younger guys. And I think over time, Wheeler wanted to do things his way and kind of became the voice of the team, or at least he wanted to be. But, Scheifele had a very different read on things. And actually, a lot of what I think we've seen over the years with Scheifele has kind of been a direct result of him wanting to follow the Jets when he thought that this team really understood how to win and that it had a clear direction. And over the years, you can kind of tell that he hasn't really bought in as much. Wheeler, I don't think ever really had that problem. I think Blake has always been very pro Jets. I feel like he likes his role. He wants to be the number one lead guy. But as his body kind of slowed down, I think you could tell it just wasn't really working out. And the captaincy thing kind of came to a head because, he'd been the voice of the team, but Bones very clearly came in with this idea that, replacing Paul Maurice, I need to put my stamp on this team and kind of change the dynamic. And I think that was one of the really driving impetuses for this whole thing. And it ended up kind of being more symbolic in a way because Wheeler still did play a pretty decent amount. But I think you did see in other areas where, Wheeler was taking a little bit of a step back. And I think he was very hurt by it. I think he probably also thought it would happen at some point. I think it's a really tough one because in his shoes, you get wanting to be, somebody who's seen as a leader on the ice and off the ice. But I think with all of these younger players really vying for spots and the core kind of aging out, Blake's time just kind of ran its course.
Yeah, that's kind of what I've, always kind of read. And, you watch different NHL programs. And obviously, with the Jets, it does sound like they're, to your point, Harrison, there's just been a little bit of a divide between those veteran players and the old guard, players and some of the new guys that have come along in recent seasons, some of the younger players. I wanted to also ask you about, obviously Wheeler going from the Jets to New York City. And, a lot of Ranger fans are hopeful here that, he's one of the final pieces and somebody that can help this team, certainly at least get out of the first round this year and potentially make a run at the whole thing. Obviously Wheeler spent a lot of time with the Jets. It's been in the playoffs a decent amount of times as well. Do you sense that he's somebody that thrives in the spotlight and when the lights are the brightest and in postseason hockey? I mean, just looking at, his build and his style of hockey, I mean, it seems like it would translate very well to postseason hockey. But again, you've watched Blake Wheeler in the playoffs a lot more than I have. So I'll let you explain that if you can.
I think if this was a different era, years ago with Wheeler, I would have been like all for it. I would have said, yeah, this is a guy that thrives. He's going to be, the difference maker. And he really was. I mean, there was a time when Wheeler was virtually unstoppable. The version of him that we have, though, since he's had, I think he had like a herniated disc in his back. His skating has really slowed down. One thing that really kind of caught me off guard with him was that like his hand-eye coordination, especially on like puck receptions and stuff, really got worse over the past few years. It was weird. It was hard to explain. I've not really seen somebody have that in the way that he did. It's gotten a lot better, I would say, over the last year. But I think with him, I don't know if it's fatigue, all of the miles that he's logged on his skates. it's hard to say exactly how much you're going to be able to get out of him. I think because on the one hand, you want to play him and make use of his great distribution, vision, and spatial awareness. But in order to do that, he's got to play more. And if he's playing more, it's kind of like, well, how much is he going to be able to keep up? And I think that's a really tough question. I think, in terms of what he did this past playoffs against Vegas, he basically left everything out there. This was probably the closest to prime Wheeler for a series that we've seen in a few years. I just don't know if he can really sustain that for the course of a season. But if he's given like a more complimentary role and he doesn't have to do all of the heavy lifting, there's a chance that he could be a pretty impactful player. I just don't know what kind of role. He signed a cheap contract that, like you said, seems middle six, right? But if he starts to play more like top six, I think that's where you run into some potential issues.
That makes sense. And I was actually going to ask you about that series against the Knights this past year in the playoffs. So we might as well just jump into that right now. And to your point, Blake Wheeler played very well. I believe it was 6 points in the 5 games there. And yeah, Vegas won in 5 games, but I think all those games were pretty close that the Jets lost, except for maybe the last one. I think game 5 was kind of lopsided. But Wheeler obviously played well there. Hypothetically speaking, let's say that the Jets somehow pull it off. They knock out the Knights in the first round. Is Blake Wheeler still a Jet right now, or was this going to happen no matter what? He was going to be gone after this past season.
I think if they had somehow won the Cup, they'd probably have just let him retire a Jet. But, I think realistically speaking, with where the core is going and with how the room has kind of progressed and that we've got all these kids. You've probably seen some of the kids the Jets have drafted. There's been like this really big focus on the chemistry, the brotherhood, all of that stuff. I feel like Wheeler isn't really a part of that group, so there may have been a chance he would have left. I think if it was a Cup, he can finish out his contract. They're just going to kind of let it ride like the Caps have. But otherwise, I think it was probably always headed to this, either a trade or a buyout.
Fair enough. And, with Wheeler and Trouba, you touched on that a little while ago. I guess it was kind of a long time ago at this point, but there was a time where, Blake Wheeler was Jacob Trouba's captain. Now it's going to be the other way around. They're going to be reuniting in New York. The two of them, what's that dynamic like? Do you remember them being close? Obviously, they spent a lot of time together playing in Winnipeg with the Jets there. So what's that relationship like?
As far as I know, I think that they were good teammates. I don't know that they were as close. I don't know if Jake was ever really part of the whole generational divide because he wasn't really around at the time when I think it really hit its peak. I know that Jake had other priorities with his family, and that kind of ended up taking precedence. I think that they'll be fine and they get along. I think it's probably fortunate that he was not a part of like the real big locker room fights later on, because if it was like Scheifele going to the Rangers, it might be a little more awkward. That could be a potential bit of friction, but Jake and Wheeler always seem to get along. I suspect it'll be the same when he moves over.
All right, and I figure we can talk about a couple other things here, Harrison. I want to get to a couple other just general things that have gone on with both the Rangers and the Jets this offseason. Got a couple of questions for you about free agency and whatnot. And obviously, a very big trade that the Jets struck not too long ago, which you've obviously covered on your show. And I figure we can get to that in just a second. But first, gotta let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting on MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets, up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think will hit the first home run, all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There is no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, the official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, and so Harrison, again, thank you so much for joining, man. I think, we all collectively as Ranger fans, anybody listening to this, I think we all got a much better feel for, Blake Wheeler and everything that happened in Winnipeg and, how he might fit in with the New York Rangers this upcoming season. Definitely looking forward to seeing how that plays out. But I did want to ask you about a couple of things, going on this offseason outside of Wheeler. Obviously, I want to get your thoughts on this. One of the bigger trades that we've seen this offseason between the Kings and the Jets. You've got Pierre-Luc Dubois going to LA. The Jets get Alex Iafallo, Gabriel Velarde, Rasmus Kapari, and a 2024 second-round pick. What do you make of the trade, and were you on board with moving Dubois for the haul that you ended up getting here?
Yeah, so I guess with hindsight, holy crap, this trade was kind of a home run for the Jets. A lot of the trades that have happened since then have just been quite awful, to be honest. I think it explains a lot of why both Hellebuck and Scheifele really haven't moved. It seems like the offers since then are just kind of trickling in. That DeBrincat trade, I'm sorry, Sens fans, that was pretty rough.
Yeah.
So even before that, though, even before all of that broke, I was pretty okay with Dubois going. I think I was kind of more in line with the idea of futures because I feel like the Jets, they're trying to do this thing where they're concerned about revenue and playoff attendance and stuff, and they want to keep butts in seats, which I get. You know, the Jets have a slightly unusual market. It's small, it's tough. You're not getting a ton of TV revenue, and so, you know, selling out the stadium is kind of critical. With Velarde and company, I feel like they've added pretty good depth, and Velarde is honestly not far off from Dubois. If you like put them next to each other, there's a chance that Gabe is actually going to be the better player, which I know is probably a hot take for some Kings fans. So if any Kings fans are listening, sorry. I do think Velarde, he's a player that I was a big fan of for many years and was honestly concerned that he just wouldn't get a chance because of his injury history. But in terms of just evaluating the trade from like the direction the Jets want to go and what they got for him, I really don't think that they could have done much better. And what really shocked me was that the Jets were just giving up Dubois and no one else. I wouldn't have cared if it was like another, you know, mid-tier prospect or something going with Dubois over to LA, but I feel like LA kind of paid a king's ransom to consolidate contracts and stuff and you know, kind of get what they feel is their missing number 2 center, and the Jets basically did enough to have a pretty legit top 9.
Yeah, I think, you know, overall the Jets certainly got a good return there, and of course there were, and you talked about this in your episode where you broke down this trade. But you know, obviously it felt like Pierre-Luc Dubois might be exaggerating a little bit here, but it always felt like he maybe kind of had one foot out the door. Like it just never felt like he was going to be a Winnipeg Jet for life. I think that's fair to say. So, you know, obviously, you know, again, I think they got a pretty good haul here for, you know, a talented player, but they got quite a bit back. Also, wanted to ask you a little bit about the captain situation because we just got done talking about how, you know, Blake Wheeler, obviously, he loses the captaincy. You guys go without a captain this past season. You had 3 alternates. You had Scheifele, Morrissey, Lowry. Do they go with a captain this year? Like, are they going to name somebody? And if they were to do that, do you have anybody that you would pick to be the next captain of the Winnipeg Jets?
I think they probably will award a captain, and I feel like it's basically Morrissey's to lose. Lowry, I think, is a good second choice, but I think if you're going to give somebody you know, Morrissey's growth under Bones and his just offensive dominance, his excellence, everything that he did this year, that and kind of the difficulty that he's had over the past few years in his personal life and how he's kind of managed to move past that and really rise to the occasion. I feel like he's the kind of guy that you're going to give the seat to, and I really can't see anybody else getting it.
All right. And I do like to every now and then when we do these crossover episodes, you know, whichever host I might be talking to, anytime there's a former Ranger on the team, you know, somebody that recently played for the Rangers, always like to, you know, check in and see how they're doing. And Morgan Barron, an impending RFA for the Jets. And, you know, he didn't play that much for the Rangers, but he seemed to make a pretty favorable impression on the fan base as somebody who just, you know, kind of a hard worker, plays every shift like it's his last, one of those type players. You know, I don't know that he'll ever be a superstar. If he does become one, I'll be the first one to say I was wrong. But with all that said, what have you seen from Morgan Barron? And do you think he ends up back with the Jets this upcoming season?
He's probably one of the most interesting players from this past season because he took a really big step forward. In terms of what kind of player he is, it's kind of funny because he reminds me of Kopp in that he does almost everything that you want out of a top 6 player, but there's just something that's going to hold him back from being like a star talent. And with him specifically, it's finishing. I don't know what it is, but that dude is like snake bitten beyond belief. He like dangles and dives through defenders very easily. I mean, he's got a super strong frame. He's got great instincts down low, and somehow he just manages to find goalies every single time. Or he hits the post. I don't know what it is. It's like the one thing that's really kept him back from being a really good middle six player. I think the Jets would be stupid not to bring him back. He seems like he actually has a lot more in the tank than I was expecting. I thought he'd be kind of what you were saying, like, a solid, maybe third or fourth line guy. But the more that he's played and the more that he's shown, I feel like if he makes that jump where he starts to become a more consistent scorer, I think there's a really legit player there.
All right. And again, when he was with the Rangers, obviously, very small sample size, but he did win over some fans in a very short amount of time. So it's interesting to hear that he's continued to progress with the Jets. Harrison, we were talking before we recorded about another former Jet that the Rangers signed, and he wasn't there for very long. I believe it was only 15 games to be exact, but you actually have a pretty funny story about him. It's Riley Nash, who I think will probably start this upcoming season with the AHL, with the Hartford Wolfpack, affiliate of the Rangers, of course. But he played in 15 games with the Jets from 2021, 2022, or that season, rather. 0 points. What did you see from Riley Nash? And, just obviously small sample size, but what did he give for the Jets while he was there?
Honestly, when he was brought on, I thought it'd be a really nice fourth line center with some defensive responsibility. I thought Nash would be, maybe not the best signing ever, but a guy who could do some depth work. Unfortunately, Nash just really wasn't very good for the Jets, and he was also asked to do things that I don't really think Winnipeg had a very great plan with, because he was like one of our few right-handed shots. Seriously, this was like a thing with him. Because he was a right-handed shot, he got put on the power play, and specifically the first power play unit. It was literally the only reason that the Jets actually had him there, and as you'd kind of expect, it really did not go well. Nash really tried hard. I mean, he fought on his shifts. It's just stuff didn't really work out for him. And then, the Jets are like, oh, we need you to become like a power play scorer. And that's just not something that he could ever do. So, yeah, that was not exactly the best 20-game sample size, if we're being honest. But, I mean, he tried. It just didn't really work out at all.
I hear you. And I got one more question for you, Harrison, and we're going to shift the attention back to Blake Wheeler. I got to know this because obviously, Wheeler, very popular for many years and then went a little bit sour toward the end, as far as how certain Jets fans looked at him. And obviously, some mixed feelings on Blake Wheeler overall from Winnipeg Jets fans. But let's go with a hypothetical situation this upcoming season. Let's say there's a spot where the Rangers make it a little bit deeper into the playoffs than the Jets do. And maybe the Rangers are getting into the second round, getting to the conference final. Are you and other Jets fans at that point, are you bandwagoning the Rangers? Do you want to see your former captain lift the Stanley Cup? Or would that be, more bitter than sweet, so to speak? I mean, just in that hypothetical situation, what would that be like for you guys?
I think most fans who are reasonable would probably be rooting for him to win a cup. I think anyone who's like a really diehard Jets fan and who knows what Wheeler was and what he meant to this team should honestly be willing to overlook some of their later stuff. I know it's going to be impossible to get past some of what happened, especially towards the end of his career, but in terms of like, bandwagoning a team to chase a cup, I feel like the Jets fans that root against him, I wouldn't really be a fan of that. I think you should be cheering for the former captain.
I hear you. And I figured we could pretty much call it there, Harrison, but this is a ton of fun, just like it is whenever we do these crossover episodes. And if you want to do this again during the season for Rangers Jets, I'm all for it.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, good stuff. So Ranger fans, Jets fans, thank you guys as always for tuning in, and we will see you next time.